In this video lesson, we're going to be talking about dodge and burn. This is the best method for evening out skin tone, and it's done by brightening or darkening irregular areas into smooth gradients, and this method is used by professional retouching artists. The two most popular methods for dodge and burn are using a grey layer or using curves. Each method has its own benefits, and I'll talk you through both of them. The grey layer is the quicker method because you don't have to move between layers to dodge or burn. With this method, all you need to do is, let's go into our retouch here, and just before getting started, I've done a quick clone and heal and done my pixel work, which is always important to do before dodging and burning. So with my pixel work done, all I need to do is go and press Control and Option and press on the new layer icon at the bottom there. Then I'm going to name my new layer Dodge and Burn, or D&B, and I'm going to turn it to Soft Light, turn the mode to Soft Light, and then fill it with a 50% grey. And I'll get this Dodge and Burn layer here. So in order to dodge and burn on this layer, you can either use your Dodge and Burn tools on your tool palette here, or you can use a brush and you can use it with white or black to dodge or burn, white being dodge and black being burn. Obviously, let's just recap that dodging is lightening and burning is darkening. So you even out areas by dodging dark areas and burning light areas to create smooth gradients. When painting, I personally set my brush to 100% opacity and 1 or 2% flow. So let me just take this down to 1% flow. Then I have my airbrush build-up effects on. And within my tool settings, I have transfer set to pen pressure. So just while we're talking about flow rates and brush settings, I just wanted to mention that with the curves method, if you're using a steeper curve, you need a lower flow rate because obviously the effect of the curve will be much greater, much more quickly. And if you're using a more subtle curve, you can have a slightly higher flow rate. So that's just something to note there. And then when it comes to having your build-up effects on and your pen pressure effects on, I find them personally great because within one stroke, I can control the effect with the amount of pressure I place and the length of time I keep the brush in one place. And I personally like that method, but I do know that there are retouchers who don't use these settings, and they're brilliant retouchers, but they come from, let's say, painting backgrounds, where they're used to going over the same area multiple times, and that's how they build up the effect. So this method is not for everyone. It's really personal to you and how you like to work. But if you're starting out in retouching, you might find that it takes a little bit of control of your hand and knowing what to do to have these settings on. So I'm mentioning them because I like them, but really it's whatever works for you. There's no right or wrong way. With the grey layer, just to note that also if you're starting out with dodge and burn, this might not be the best method for you. It is quicker, but you're doing both your dodging and your burning on one layer, whereas I'll show you in curves, you do your dodge and your burn on separate curve layers. So if you wanted to roll back at any point the retouching you've done with dodging, or if you've gone too far with the burning, you're stuck with a grey layer because you've done it all on one layer. So it's just more adjustable if you do it with curves. But as mentioned, this method is a lot quicker, so that's the attraction here. A slight downside to the grey layer method is that when you are dodging and burning shadow and highlight areas, you can often get, and this is in general, so you can get the shadow areas can become overly saturated when you've lifted them, and highlight areas can become grey when you bring them down. And this is because shadow areas in an image are typically more saturated than the mid-tone or highlight areas, and highlight areas are typically less saturated than the mid-tone or shadow areas in an image. So when you then dodge or burn on a grey layer and these areas start looking overly saturated, when you've done this on a curves layer, you can then isolate that area using the mask that you've dodged and burned on. But because you're not dodging and burning on a mask with a grey layer, you then follow up with a local color correction above the dodge and burn layer, which you do manually. So it's just a little bit less easy, or not as simple as when you've got a mask on your curves layer, but it is still possible to do. I personally prefer to use curves on skin. And whilst it's slower, this technique has some benefits which I've mentioned, but I'll show you slightly more in detail. When I'm creating a dodge and burn curves group, I obviously have a curve which I lift to about there. I then invert it and label it dodge. Then I have a curve which I drop about an equal distance. And I personally like to take the highlight area down slightly. And this is just to lower that saturation somewhat. But now I've lowered the saturation slightly, so it won't become as overly saturated, but I'm now going to face the problem of my highlights going grey if I go to the very white areas. So what I do to correct that is I go into my reds and I add some reds to the highlights, just very subtly. And then I go into my blue channel and I add some yellow to the highlights. And that just stops my highlights from going grey. This is obviously specific to skin. If you were retouching product, for instance, you wouldn't want these warmer tones in your burning layer. So I'm now going to invert this and I'm going to label it burn. I'm then going to create a group and I'm going to call it dodge and burn. And I'm going to put this, just because this is the way I like to organize my layers, I'm going to put this group within my retouching group. And then now with my brush set to 1% flow, 100% opacity, and the airbrush and transfer settings on, I'm going to start my dodging and burning. So luminosity irregularities are the darker and lighter patches in the skin. These variations in luminosity in the skin can make it look uneven or unclean. And it is our goal as retouchers to even out the luminosity levels of these patches to make the skin texture look more even. That is what we use the dodge and burn technique for. For anyone looking to really understand dodge and burn, the most important thing to know is not which method you should use, whether curves are better than a grey layer, or what brush settings you should use. The important aspect of this technique is to learn to see which areas need to be dodged and which areas need to be burned. It is the ability to see those areas of various scale which will create the illusion of a more even surface once they have been addressed with dodge and burn. Be it skin texture in a portrait or a macro beauty shot, even skin tone on legs or arms in a full body shot, or a product surface. The same rules apply for evening out any surface with dodge and burn. Let me show you what it is that you need to learn to see to be able to address those luminosity inconsistencies, which once dodged and burned will create the illusion of the even skin texture that we're after. So I'm going to create two layers here, one which I'm going to label dodge, and I'm going to mark up the areas that I would dodge in green on this layer. And then I'm going to label this layer burn, and I'm going to mark up the areas that I would burn in pink. This is one of the most important elements of this technique, being able to identify those luminosity variations and irregularities. The luminosity irregularities in the skin are not very noticeable to the human eye in real life or in a video. But when images are photographed with strong studio or natural direct light, any skin with less than perfect complexion will have them. It's those tiny peaks and valleys in the texture of human skin that create the little highlights and shadows, making skin look uneven. And these are more visible when photographed with hard light as opposed to soft studio or ambient light. That's why it's only logical to cast models with flawless skin complexion for commercial or editorial shoots where hard lighting is used, and there will be a lot less post-production required if the model's skin texture is already very even. Overall, in beauty retouching, we typically want to minimize those variations in luminosity on the skin, and the smaller patches we choose to address, the more polished the final result will be. So, depending on the purpose and style of the images you are working on, you will need to choose the scale of those patches you're going to dodge and burn. A common mistake in retouching is to zoom in too far and end up over-retouching an image because of that. Always keep in mind that the more you zoom in and work on the patchiness of the smallest scale, the more time you will spend retouching and the more risk there is of over-retouching an image that would otherwise look more natural if you hadn't zoomed in that close. This image looks more like a skincare shot, so we don't want to go in too deep and retouch luminosity variations on the smallest scale. As you can see, I've been marking up the larger irregularities such as gaps in the hairline, or these, as you can see, these gaps here, or those patches above the eyebrows. And then with dodging, I was marking up the rings under the eyes first and the lines on the neck as the larger areas first, and then just zoom in a little bit closer to start getting the more mid-sized patches or irregularities in the skin that need to be dodged or burned. And that's not to say that you should never zoom in closely to an image while dodging and burning. Sometimes you will need to zoom in and retouch on a closer scale, but only when there is an area that has a bunch of much smaller and more contrasty patches, and we need to zoom in to work with smaller brushes and with more precision. But don't forget to zoom back out and double check the area that you have just worked on looks like from a distance when the entire image is visible. Often what looks right up close doesn't look as good or can look over-retouched when you're more zoomed out. When I'm done with marking this image up, I'm going to toggle the marked dodge and burn layers I have made here on and off. And I hope that by doing this, the areas that I would address will pop out to your eye, and that if you are having any difficulty seeing what needs to be dodged and burned, you will have a better idea of what it is you need to see when approaching dodge and burn. So here are some of the areas, if I just toggle this on and off, that I would burn. And as you can see, the scale is not too zoomed in, or I'm not working with really fine details here, just the sort of mid and larger patches. And here as well, the areas that I would dodge. And that's not to say these are the only areas I would dodge. This is just to give you an understanding of the type of approach I would take. And now I think we can delete these. As you can see, if we were to just take a look at the image, this area might need a slightly more zoomed in approach, whereas, the forehead and cheeks are relatively even and don't need that. And so that's local dodge and burn when you address luminosity irregularities within the skin.